Hi everybody, it's Michael Hollands once again for Sound of the Movies. Today I have the pleasure to talk to film composer Joe Kraemer. Over the past several years, Joe has gained lots of experience writing music for several TV series and also big Hollywood movies such as Jack Reacher, The Way of the Gun, Mission Impossible 5, Rogue Nation. One of his most recent projects was the Amazon TV series Comrade Detective starring Channing Tatum and Joseph Gordon-Levitt, which we will also talk about here in detail. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Sure thing.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining me here. Joe, the first well, first of all, I would like
hmm
to know more about your musical education and how and well about the point in your life when you decided to write music for film and television.
Well, I grew up in a musical household. My father and my uncle used to write and record their own songs using, reel-to-reel tape recorders and then cassette 4 tracks, home recording equipment. So I just assumed that everybody wrote their own songs and sang songs and, did their own thing. So I grew up writing music and writing songs and imitating my parents and, imitating the bands that I liked, the Beatles and things like that.
Yeah.
And I also listened to film music, on LP. Listened to the soundtrack to Star Wars and the soundtrack to Superman. I was a huge John Williams fan. And in junior high, when I was about 13 or so, I became friends with a filmmaker named Scott Storm, who was 18. He was a senior in school. And I don't know, a year or so after that, he made a film on Super 8. And I would have been about 15 by this point, 14 or 15. And he asked me to play a part in the movie, the lead role. And so I was acting in this movie as a kid. And then also I would talk to him, between takes about what he would do for music in his movies. And because I had this studio at home that my dad had put together, I had the equipment on hand to write music for his movie. And he thought this was great because he wouldn't have to rely on copywritten music from his record collection any longer. He could have something that was, free and clear. And so at 15 or so, I was scoring a movie, feature-length film shot and edited on Super 8. And I had no craft. It was all instinct. Whatever craft I had was self-taught. But it sort of whet my appetite for, marrying music to picture. And as I finished high school and decided, on a course for my future, for my education, I decided to go to Berklee College of Music in Boston, not only because they had recording studios and facilities that and resources that I thought would help my songwriting career, but they also had film music classes, which interested me as well. And then when I got there, I sort of looked at the landscape of, it took about a year for me to get my feet, wet and get settled. And as I started looking at the landscape of potential careers, I realized that this experience I'd had doing these movies was very unique and kind of gave me an edge that a lot of others maybe hadn't had the good fortune to experience those things. One of Scott's friends was Bryan Singer.
Yeah.
So I was, 15 and working on movies with Bryan and his writing partner, Chris McQuarrie. And so I've known these guys my whole life. And as they started to make headway out here in LA, I was in Boston studying at Berklee and decided to focus on film music and take all the songwriting and music production courses that I could take on the side. But the film music became my primary focus, and I learned, the craft of synchronizing to picture properly and the craft of conducting and orchestration and leading recording sessions and things like that, and basically developed all the skills that I would need to get out to Los Angeles and start, chipping away at a lifelong career in film music. So that's sort of the story in a somewhat bloated nutshell.
um, You've mentioned John Williams.
Hmm.
Which composers would you say are your primary influence, musically speaking or stylistically speaking?
Well, the ones I'm conscious of are John Williams, David Shire, Jerry Goldsmith. Those are probably the big three that I think about when I write. Um, John Williams in terms of the craft and the arranging skills and the gift for melody.
Yeah.
David Shire in terms of the um, the ability to set such a great tone with rhythm and color. And then Goldsmith, because a lot of the avant-garde stuff, really, I think Goldsmith brought to the table, which was just fantastic.
Yeah.
Um, I People tell me they hear John Barry in my music, but I'm never really aware. Like I'm never consciously doing that, if that makes sense. And
Yeah.
I don't deny that it might be there to other people's opinion, but I don't really hear it the same way. So
Yeah, John Barry. Well, I don't really hear John Barry in your music, to be honest. So I'm kind
mhm.
of
Yeah,
yeah, but I think that's a well opinions
it's a
of it.
subjective thing.
It
But if
is.
you read different liner notes or comments online, you'll see some people likening it to John Barry, and you know, if they hear it, great. I'm not insulted by the comparison.
No, no,
I am a fan of John
no.
Barry. So.
Yeah, me too. I mean, John Barry was one of the greats and
Hmm.
rightfully considered, one of the best composers of the business ever. I mean,
Hmm.
at least that's
Yeah.
yeah. But it's always no matter how many people I've talked to and no matter how many composers I've talked to, you always hear Jerry Goldsmith. It's basically, in 90% of the time, people refer to Jerry Goldsmith as one of their primary influences when it comes to scoring. It's just, I mean, it goes to show you how important this man was for our industry.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think Williams and Goldsmith are the two sort of biggest icons of the craft. I mean, I would say that Korngold, Steiner, Bernard Herrmann, Goldsmith, and Williams. I mean, obviously there's tons of others that have made an impact. Miklos Rozsa, Dmitri Tiomkin, Elmer Bernstein. But I think if you take Korngold, Steiner, Goldsmith, and Williams, if you were to somehow magically erase them from film music, the hole the hole that those five voices would leave would be, it'd be an abyss. It'd be a chasm that you couldn't fill.
Absolutely. I mean, those guys basically started um, the whole thing. They were so all over the place back in the day, and so many composers today, they kind of, I feel like that the Korngolds and Newmans and the Steiners, pass the torch to all those other people, like Hans Zimmer or James Newton Howard, Danny Elfman, and all those other, genius composers. So, but it's always great to look at the past and see how it all started, basically.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
How would you describe your work process? How early do you usually like to get involved with a new project?
Well, in a perfect world, I would like the movie to be locked, and then I'd be like to be left alone for 12 weeks to write the score. And then I'd like to turn over the score, much the same way an actor would turn over a performance, and then let the director and a music editor adjust the score as they see fit so that it works in the film the way the director wants it. Now, that's what I would want in a perfect world. That, never happens. I try not to read the script. I mean, obviously, if I'm working on a film where there's music that needs to be created, during the shoot, then I read the script, But if I don't have to read the script, I try not to, because I'd rather score the movie, and I'd rather see the movie with no preconception than to score the movie based on impressions I formed reading the script. Um, I mean, again, if there's time, I'd love to see the movie without any temp score.
Yep.
But, the problem is there's often so little time that the temp score is the only way that the filmmakers can communicate to me what they want. And they've fallen in love with the temp score, and I'm now in a position where I'm sort of competing with it. And I can either get mad and gripe and refuse to listen to their guidance, or I can accept the fact that they love it, and it's up to me to try to give them something that works for them without violating the artistic integrity of the original material, by ripping it off.
Yes.
And, like everybody else in the business, sometimes I'm better at that, and sometimes I'm, less good at covering my tracks, but, I don't know any composer who enjoys dealing with the temp or is copying somebody else's music on purpose. Usually they're pushed into a corner where they have to do it. In terms of creating the material for the film, I'll watch it with even if I've watched it without a temp score at first, if there is a temp score, I'll watch the temp score at least once in the process. In the case of a director like Chris McQuarrie, there wasn't much temp score. There wasn't any temp score in Reacher, and there was very little in Mission Impossible, except for instances where they had to have test screenings, and temp scores were created for those screenings, and that's it. They weren't ever, and they were done by outside people, not by the Chris or the picture editor.
Okay.
And I was generally not shown those because Chris didn't want the music in the film to be a ripoff of the temp. So essentially what I do is I think about the movie and I try to sort of approach composing themes and motivic elements for the score in my head away from an instrument, thinking about character and thinking about story. And, in my studies, I've developed certain, not tricks, but sort of techniques for interpreting character musically and interpreting story musically. And I play with those until I come up with an idea. Then I sit down at the piano and I fiddle with the idea, and I'll make notes in a journal that I keep at the piano. And at some point, I realize I've got enough material. Either the schedule is such that I have to start writing, whether I've got the material or not, or I've got enough material that I'm kind of chomping at the bit to start writing the cues. So then I move into my writing room and start working at the computer against the picture and writing the cues sort of properly against picture, using the material that I've sketched in my journal as sort of the foundation for the score. And I'll create what I call a cheat sheet, which will, it'll have, it might say principal theme, villain theme, love theme, action motif, things like that. And I'll refer to that sheet while I'm working on the score. I'll look at a scene and essentially say, okay, well, it's the action beat and then the villain beat and then the love theme for 3 seconds or an allusion to the love theme. And basically almost assemble the score out of the sketches that I've made at the piano. And that's and then I'll show that to the director or the producers or the writers or whoever, needs to sign off on the music and get their feedback, and then do my best to incorporate their feedback into, a round of revisions. And then if it's going to be recorded live, at that point, it's my computer files are sent to the orchestrator, who takes my very detailed mock-ups and converts them to sheet music while I'm doing other revisions and doing other things that need to be done before the recording session. And if it isn't going to be live, I just mix the mock-ups down and send them off to the dubbing stage so they can be mixed into the movie. And that's kind of the process.
Okay. It's a complicated process sometimes, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, anything involving as many moving parts as a film
Yeah,
is going to have complications. But it's still, at its core, it's very simple, which is that I watch it, I see how I feel, and I write music that I think is appropriate for that feeling.
absolutely. Uh, Joe, you've just mentioned the test screenings as well.
Hmm.
Those test screenings at times can be rather crucial as to how they continue on with the project. I think test screenings should not be overrated, but they should, also be given, let's say, some kind of significance. Have you ever been in a situation in which a test screening has influenced your score? I mean, have producers or directors ever come up to you and said, "Well, we've got this kind of feedback from the test screenings when people filled out the questionnaires. We would like you to make adjustments or anything like that."
Absolutely. One specific example I can think of is in Jack Reacher,
Yeah.
the first one, which I worked on. There was an effort to sort of romantically link Tom and Rosamund Pike's characters, to link Jack Reacher to Helen Rodin in a romance. And there were some pieces of music that were written to help push that agenda. And the test audience did not really embrace this approach to the characters. And it was decided that the romance did not need to be part of the movie, and a couple of scenes were trimmed and shots were cut out, and a couple of cues were pulled from the score to back us away from that element of the plot. And I thought it was totally valid to pull that out, and I was not. I supported that and was totally behind it. Trying to think about, like, maybe on Rogue Nation what some of the test audience feedback was. I mean, I know that there was some Mission Impossible. It's interesting because a thing like Mission Impossible, there's an expectation that the audience has,
Yeah.
that they're going to get a certain experience. And when a certain thing happens, they're going to have certain expectations. And you can either deliver on those expectations or you can hold off on those expectations. And certainly in Way of the Gun and Jack Reacher, Christopher McQuarrie and I would hold back on certain things and then, sort of trickle them out and tease the audience with things rather than just push a reaction button every time something happened. And there was some back and forth early in the process between the director, myself, and the producer, Tom Cruise, about how much do we push the Mission Impossible buttons and how much do we lay back. And we were conservative in our approach early on, and a test screening sort of taught us that the audience wanted more. And especially Tom and I were very excited that the audience was giving us the freedom to push further and to push some of those buttons more than we had on Reacher and Way of the Gun. So there, the test audience the final product of the score, to a degree, is a result of the test audience asking for it, which I'm, again, grateful for. I think test audience, like you say, can be very helpful. I think where it can be very difficult is when it becomes some sort of, where it's regarded as an infallible source of feedback. Because if you show somebody a movie, if somebody pays money, if somebody sees a trailer and says, I want to see that movie, then they pay money and they see the movie, they're sort of going in on your side and wanting to like it. And when you call somebody in and say, we've got this movie we're working on and we'd really love your opinion about it, automatically they start looking for all the problems with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Their mindset is the opposite, because instead of being something that they've gone out of their way and made all these plans to do, they are sort of being told, this is broken, help us fix it. And the same audience that might love Kill Bill will come to a screening of The Way the Gun and say, well, there's an awful lot of violence and swearing in it. And it's like, well, you're the same people that loved, Pulp Fiction and Reservoir Dogs. So I don't understand,
Yeah,
you know?
sure. I mean, Pulp Fiction, I think, is one of the movies that has the most swearing, and I mean,
Yeah.
totally. It's like one of the the top scorers. um, but I think, well, Ridley Scott once said it can be tricky to have a test screening because people walk in there wanting to be critics.
Right, exactly.
And I think they sometimes have the tendency to be overly critical of something, which or they could have fixed that, or they should fix that. Whereas if they were at home watching it on this on the couch, for instance, they would be totally fine with it. Just like you've just
Well,
indicated.
some of that, too, is just like when you spend... All right, so let's say you've got a couple of kids, so you have to get a babysitter. Then you're going out to the movies. Well, you're also going to go out to dinner. You're going to make a night of it with your spouse. So watching a movie on streaming on Netflix is free and very sort of like, if it sucks, I'll turn it off. And if it's not a piece of junk, I'll leave it on. Whereas at a movie in the theater, it's like, if this thing isn't worth the time and effort I've gone to come see it, I'm going to be pissed. So you sort of, I think the audience sort of makes a deal with himself that, like, no, I'm going to like it, whether it's good or bad. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, sure.
To a degree. I mean, this is all to say I agree with what you're saying, and I agree with what Ridley said. There's the formality of seeing something live, both, or not live, but sort of outside of the house, not on TV in your living room, makes it something that, to a degree, we let different things slide than we would if we were in a test audience, where we might be much more on top of things. The other thing about test audience, too, is that you're showing them an unfinished film, and you can tell people a million times it's not done, but they're not gonna think of that when they're reacting to the film emotionally. And if something doesn't work and it takes them out of the movie because of a technical reason, like a green screen or a piece of music that they recognize from another movie that isn't perfect, but it's in there to indicate something, that'll get magnified by them realizing it, and the studio will freak out about it when they don't really need to. If that makes sense.
It does.
Yeah.
I mean, of all the projects you've worked on so far, which one would you say put you really on the map in Hollywood?
That's interesting. I mean, I suppose depends on how you mean put me on the map.
Yeah.
I mean, to a certain degree, I still feel like I'm trying to get on the map, and I suppose that feeling never really goes away. Over the course of a career, there's always somebody else who's sort of doing what you want to do, and you're hoping to reach that point. And you're not always looking behind you going, oh, there's all these other people that want to do what I do, So I don't mean to sound disingenuous. Certainly with Way the Gun, I thought, well, this is my big sort of, debutante coming out dance. And it didn't really pan out. The movie was kind of a flop.
Yep.
But, Ron Howard has temped the score to Way the Gun into every movie he's made since it came out. His own editors admit it in print that they use Way the Gun as their temp on every movie. They've never called me to score a film, which is kind of a drag, but,
Yeah.
So I'm on Ron Howard's map, for what that's worth. I thought Reacher might be open doors to opportunities, but, again, the movie itself was kind of a sleeper hit. It didn't break any box office records, and then it really sort of blossomed on what we used to call home video, like Netflix and streaming and DVD. And when they went to make the sequel, the director they switched directors, and Ed Zwick, who directed the sequel, didn't want to use anybody who'd worked on the first film. So despite Tom's very vocal appreciation of the score for Reacher, I was not asked back to do the sequel. Reacher may have put me on some map, but oddly enough, it didn't put me on the Reacher map. If you want to sort of be, if you want to be funny about it, I'm not complaining.
Yeah.
I just kind of take it a day at a time. I mean, the one thing I'll say is that there are many composers that we're all like sick of. They've just done so many movies, and it's like every time we turn around, they're doing another movie, and they're not really, and they're doing so much work that you can just tell they're burned out. And the benefit to, sort of still feeling like an up-and-comer is that people aren't sick of me yet. So I'm grateful for that. At least I hope they're not.
I don't think so. No, they're not.
So there's always a silver lining.
Absolutely.
And I try to look at that, because if you look at the dark side of things, this business will kill your soul.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean,
Not to get too heavy.
No. But I think that's one of the things in many people. I mean, regardless if it's the movie industry or they're just regular people. They tend to focus more on the dark side, and they completely black out the things in life that make them happy, and they tend to focus more on the let's say the conundrums, and that's not what I want my life to be, and they focus on 2 bad things and as opposed to the 10 good things in their lives. And I think that's also very much it's so
yeah.
Yeah.
There's a certain point, there's a certain school of thought that says, well, if you've scored a Mission Impossible movie, you should be able to pick up the phone and get whatever job you want in Hollywood. And that's not the reality. But the other side of the coin is that I never in my life thought I'd record an album at Abbey Road,
Yeah, okay.
And I got to do that. So it's not all bad.
No, it certainly isn't. And I mean, the films, Jack Reacher, I mean, I liked the first Reacher a lot. I mean, I watched it in the theater, and when I walked out, I thought, okay, it's a decent film. When I watched it again at home, I thought it was an even better movie. And what I like about Reacher is how, let's say, slowly the story evolves. And I think Chris McQuarrie did a really good job here. It's not one of those action movies or action thrillers that are completely over the top and filled with explosions and all that stuff. It really it tells a story, and it does so in a calm fashion. And yeah, I mean, it does have a great sense of humor in there. Lots of great one-liners, especially by Tom Cruise. Yeah. And of course your score. I mean, it was really good.
Well, thank you. I mean, definitely we tried to make a film that, McQuarrie has a very big concern about pandering to the audience. He really tries to be as intelligent as possible, and to make intelligent films. And the nice thing about making a film that's smart is that the audience, I think, feels rewarded when they figure out what's going on. The trick is to make your film accessible but smart. You don't want to make a film that's so sort of obtuse that the audience can't penetrate it and figure out what's going on. So, you might argue that, say, Upstream Color or Donnie Darko are films that are so, like Inside Baseball is sort of an American saying. They're so of their own universe and in their own language that the casual moviegoer may be too frustrated trying to decode the movie to get to really embrace it. McQuarrie, I think, is trying sort of to do maybe what Kubrick could do, which is make a film that was heady and not obvious, but still accessible. And certainly with Reacher, the score reflected that approach. There's some 70s films like Clute
Yeah.
and All the President's Men, The Parallax View. Those were the sort of paranoid trilogy of Alan Pakula. And those three movies, I think, are a huge influence on Chris, visually, storytelling-wise, and their approach to music. The Verdict is another one by Sidney Lumet. The approach to music in those films, I think, is in McQuarrie's comfort zone of what score should do, and definitely Gunn and Reacher reflect that. Mission is a different bird, and is more in line with the sort of traditional Hollywood approach, definitely in terms of how much music there is,
Yes.
but also in terms of what it does.
Yeah. I mean,
a lot of Reacher and Gunn, the score was there to build tension, and then the tension would sort of reach a point where the film would explode into an action sequence, and then we would take the music out and let the sound design
yes.
play the action sequence.
Absolutely. I mean, that was totally, totally noticeable. Reacher had less score than, let's say, Mission 5.
Well, yeah, by a mile.
By a mile, yes. And Mission 5, I think, well, to me the best Mission Impossible films are the first one by Brian De Palma, Mission 4 and Mission 5. And
Great.
yeah, that's my perspective. And I mean, Mission 2 by John Woo was a bit of a mess, I believe. I mean, the film, at least as far as I'm concerned, didn't live up to my expectation. I mean, when I loved De Palma's vision on Mission 1, and I was totally disappointed when I walked out of Mission 2. And I felt Mission 3 was a step up. I mean, it was a lot better than the second one, but Mission 4 and 5 really picked up. I mean, the quality here, it was like a huge difference. And your score for Mission 5, I think, was really, really great. I mean, you also did a nice job of incorporating the Puccini opera, the Turandot, which you also used. And the film is also total fun, and I think it's makes for great entertainment.
Well, thank you. Definitely the ultimate goal of these things is to be entertaining. If there's more that can be snuck in underneath the entertainment, great. For me, as a composer, my principal interest now, I guess, is literacy.
Yeah.
For lack of a better term. And, a big frustration for me as a film viewer is that most composers today seem to be rock musicians who gave up touring, who wanted to stop touring and became film composers. And the vocabulary of rock music is very simple, by its nature. And that's not a dig, and that doesn't mean it can't still be profound. There's
Sure.
no chord in A Day in the Life by the Beatles that you can't play on a guitar, but the song is profound.
Yeah.
The thing is, there's a sophistication to Goldsmith and Williams that pretty much no one today is really doing. Not like they did. Not like Williams is still doing. And it's because I think the bulk of the film music industry now centers on rock and pop music and not really on jazz or classical music, conservatorially trained composers. So if there is something different about my work, it's that I'm striving to be less like a rock musician and more like a conservatorially trained composer.
Yeah. I mean, the industry has changed a lot, and actually I've spoken to quite a few people, and we talked about the subject, about the industry and how the tastes have changed, and the generation of filmmakers, of course, is totally different now as opposed to 30 years ago. But I think there's
Well, and it's funny because I think there's a disconnect between the industry and the audience.
yeah,
Because, I hope I can say this without sounding arrogant. I've gotten nothing but positive feedback for my score to Mission 5 from audiences and from the world. You know what I mean?
yeah, sure,
From the film music community, from online reviews. Um, and the industry, certainly in LA, doesn't really seem to care. There are, and that's, I mean, there are young filmmakers who are so excited for the possibility of having a score like a John Williams type score in their movie, and there's no one that can do it. And I think the industry right now, what Hollywood is making, is not what audiences really want to see. And they're blaming streaming for lower revenues in theaters. They're blaming bootlegs or piracy. But the truth is, I think there's a disconnect between what the filmmakers want to make, what the studios want to pay for, or something that isn't getting made
yeah,
in theaters, and that extends to the music too. I think audiences are tired of a certain, and you're seeing it come out in pop culture. The Guardian in London just had a big article about like maybe it's time to give a certain composer and his sound a rest. Does every movie have to sound like this composer?
yeah.
You know?
I've come across that. Yeah, I did.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that's not some composer, frustrated composer complaining that all the jobs are being gobbled up by one guy. That's somebody in the audience going, how come every time I go to the movies I have to hear the same score over and over again?
yeah. But that's always very interesting, and I think you can't really blame the composer. I don't think you can do that because the composer writes in a certain style, and if everybody picks up on that and they say, well, we love that, they make sure that they temp his or her score for many many pictures, and you can't really. I don't think you can blame the composer for the industry, taking the his music and kind of using it over and over again.
Well, I'll say this again. I don't think any fan of film music is making a mistake if they believe that any major film reflects the composer's vision for the score.
Yep.
I don't think. I mean, the cases where that's true are few and far between. Now, I'm very lucky in Mission Impossible. I would say 80% of that score reflects my vision for the music. There are cues that I was asked to change, and I did change. There were cues that were signed off on, and then when they got to the dub, they were moved around and changed. There are things in the film version of the score that weren't my decision and weren't even my work, and that's part of the process of making a movie. And you surrender ultimate control to the director or the producer or whoever's paying for the movie. And it's wrong for film music fans to assume that if a score either works or doesn't work, it's entirely 100% the work of the composer.
Yep.
In this day and age. But by the same token, there are composers where you can tell they are still trying to be innovative, and there are composers where you can tell they've just given up and they're just phoning it in and cashing the check. And I think if you can tell, the audience can tell, and I think they're reacting to that.
Yeah. I mean,
But that's just my 2 cents.
yeah, sure.
Yeah, and I'm not naming names. You know what I mean?
No.
It's not. I'm not trying to be a jerk. There are sports teams where you can look at the players on the team and you go, "This guy is working his butt off to score goals for this team," and then you look at another team and you go, "That guy used to be great, and now he's just coasting till he can retire."
Yeah,
It happens everywhere, you
yeah,
know?
sure, sure. I mean, it's really, really interesting. I think we could probably talk and analyze this topic for another 2 hours or so. So it's always really difficult to tell where the input is coming from. And one composer that I like a lot actually once said, "Input is not necessarily coming from the person who hits the keys."
Right. You know, I mean, there's also reputation. There's also sort of expectation. You know, I mean, there's the way people work. You know, for example, John Williams is about the only composer alive who is not expected to do mock-ups. And there that has a ripple effect on the entire process of scoring a film with him, because there really isn't the same level of meddling happening during the creation of the score. Whatever meddling happens after it's been recorded generally, because it's too expensive to make the orchestra sit around while he rewrites cues. So generally, what you hear in the score is probably closer to his vision for it than most other filmmakers and or composers, and also the CD is probably his vision. Um, I know, like on Force Awakens, the schedule was set up so that they could record stuff and then go back and do rewrites and re-record it, and that is a unique situation for John Williams. Generally, it's like he'd record it. The director might give notes during the scoring session, but then after that, it's up to the music editor to really execute any big changes to the score after it's been recorded. Whereas for pretty much every other composer, there's this micromanaging that happens before the score ever hits the podium, that every note has been obsessed over by the director, producers, marketing people, you name it. You know, the nanny of the director's kids could come in and give an opinion about the music. You know,
Yeah, it's yeah. Sounds.
and there's this weird knee-jerk reaction that the composer is sort of regarded as not being, you know, because the composer is a musician and wrote the music, you can't trust their opinion because they can't see because it's assumed that they can't see the forest for the trees, you know? So the fact that they're an expert at music invalidates their opinion.
Oh yeah, that's.
Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, sure, sure.
And again, it's just, these are just aspects of the business, you know? This is, you know, it is show business, not show art.
Yeah, that's exactly what Bruce Broughton said to me a couple of weeks ago. Basically, the very same, almost the very same expression. It's not the art business; it's the show biz. Yeah.
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 You know, but what's gratifying is to be able to sneak moments of art in, to be able to sneak Nessun Dorma into a tentpole action film, you know, to be able to score movies with themes. You know, like, we haven't talked about Comrade Detective at all yet, but like that score, to be able to do a TV score with live instruments and thematic motivic writing, proper scoring, it's, you know, it's great to be able to sneak that through into the zeitgeist.
Absolutely. When we've talked about quite a few things now, and it's really interesting here, the stuff we cover, and yeah, I mean that's nowadays I think the whole business has become rather complicated, and like it just, I mean, there's so much input, like the example you use with directors and Annie coming in and giving feedback. I mean, I can imagine that everybody is coming in, from the music editor to the producer, director, associate producers, and everybody offers their 2 cents. And it can be, I think, a pretty frustrating experience.
Well, I mean, I would argue that in the majority of Hollywood filmmaking, it's the music editor or the picture editor that are really scoring the movies now. It's not the composers aren't scoring movies anymore. The composers are trying to make a legally viable alternative to the temp. And the composer is not brought in, and they're not asked, hey, look at this movie and tell us what the music should be. The picture editor and the composer have already figured that out, or the picture editor and the music editor have already solved that problem, in quotes. And they just want you to execute a new version that does everything the temp does. I would say that 90% of the time, that's what's going on. And that it's very rare that a composer is brought in and said, we don't know what we want, we don't know what to do, help us do this. Part of that is because the budgets have become so tight that they don't want to, it's cheaper to hire a music editor to make 15 different temp scores until they find the one they want than it is to hire a composer, have them write it, and then rewrite it, and then rewrite it, So, in my experience, most of the films I work on, they don't actually, a lot of the projects I've worked on, McQuarrie has been unique in this regard because most of the projects I've been brought in on, the tone of the score and the kind of score it is has already been decided by the editors.
Yeah. That's
So I mean, if you're a musician out there and you really want to sort of innovate the sound of film music, become a music editor or a picture editor, and you'll have actually more control over the score than a composer will.
it's amazing.
Well, it's all about risk. And movies are expensive. TV shows are expensive, and they're risks. And there are efforts in place to help minimize the risk and to help guarantee certain returns. And test audiences are one of those returns. And if you test a movie and you get a certain score, and part of the reason you got that score, in your opinion, is the temp score, then messing with the temp score runs the risk of lowering that test score. And you lower that test score, and you start losing more. Then the studio gets nervous, and you start losing control of your movie. You know what I mean? Now,
Yeah.
I have no inside info on this, but let's look at Blade Runner 2049. Denis Villeneuve directs the movie. He did The Arrival. He did Sicario. He did
Prisoners.
He's got a great reputation right now. He's sort of a darling in Hollywood, and he got his collaborator Johan Johansson to do the score. And again, all I know is what I've read online. I have zero inside info on this, but looking at it from the outside, my guess is that there was a test. I mean, the funny thing is, this is a sequel to a movie that was a flop. Blade Runner was a flop when it came out.
Yep.
It's become a cult hit, and they've made a sequel to it. And my guess is that the test audience scores of the sequel were not up to Warner Brothers' expectations. And they can't go back and shoot the whole movie again.
Yep.
But they can change the score.
Yep.
And so they tried to, probably Dennis begged them not to fire Johan Johansson. And they brought Zimmer and his people are the darlings of Warner Brothers. Look at statistically the number of Warner Brothers movies that Zimmer and his army are scoring, and you'll see that Warner Brothers is a Zimmer studio. Warner Brothers brought Hans and his people in to help out, quote, on Blade Runner, and now Johan's completely off the film, and he's been replaced 100% by Hans and company.
Yeah.
So I seriously doubt that that's a case of the score didn't work or it wasn't doing what the director wanted.
Yep.
My guess is that a test audience didn't like the movie, which isn't a surprise. It's a sequel to a flop. You know what I mean?
Yeah, sure.
What did they expect?
Yeah.
Tron was not a huge hit when it came out, and they were surprised when the sequel was equally lukewarm received.
Yeah.
Just because something becomes a cult hit does not mean that a sequel is then going to be a hit.
Absolutely.
So, art's got nothing to do with it.
Yep. That's very true.
This all sounds so negative, and I'm really not just it.
No.
It's just the reality of the business.
It's just...
and I really hope I don't come off like a cranky old man.
No.
It's really not that bad.
No, it's totally fascinating. I mean, you don't come across as bitter at all. I mean, it feels like we are talking turkey here. I mean, it's really we are getting into it, and I mean, it's as soon as I read that Hans was coming in, and also Ben Wallfish to help Johansson write the score, I knew immediately that something was up, and that's the shit is probably hitting the fan. Just pardon my
Right.
French. And as soon as I read that, I just thought to myself, okay, Johan is probably out, you know.
Yep.
And a couple of days later, they actually announced that Johan was removed or had been removed from the project, you know.
Yep. So, make of that what you will. But it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be a bit. A composer should not necessarily regard film composing as a means of self-expression, any more than a painter who paints. Any more than Jackson Pollock should become a set painter.
Yep.
The fact that John Williams is able to get away with what he gets away with is as much a testament to the fact that he has been doing it so long that he's become sort of the composer emeritus of Hollywood, and he's given a leeway that no one else is given. And the other thing is his approach is from a different era. It's the same reason that you don't see very many films being made. It's the reason why the sequel to, and I haven't seen the sequel to Jack Reacher, but by all accounts, the sequel to Jack Reacher looks and feels nothing like the first one.
It doesn't.
There's the classic style, and then there's sort of the contemporary style. And maybe the epitome of the contemporary style are filmmakers like Zack Snyder and Michael Bay. And then maybe the epitome of the classic style are Spielberg and,
Scorsese,
Yeah. Maybe Zemeckis a little bit in terms of, middle ground.
Yeah, Robert Zemeckis.
Ron Howard is really more of a classical filmmaker than a contemporary one,
Yeah,
for example.
he is.
So,
Clint Eastwood.
yeah. And I think the studio thinks all kids want to see are movies like Michael Bay and Zack Snyder movies. And I think there's room for all of that.
There is.
But I think that Hollywood right now thinks that the only thing they seem interested in making are the more Snydery, Michael Bay sort of movies.
Yeah. Yeah.
Television has really become the place where the 70s style of storytelling seems to blossom. And to its credit, I mean, the truth is you could never make a film of Breaking Bad. You could never have a character go through the arc that Walter White goes through in a movie. It's just too short. And movies are so expensive now that when Tom Cruise walks on screen, he has to be Tom Cruise from the minute you see him. And you have to know exactly who he is because these movies are too expensive to spend a lot of time developing character.
Yep. That sounds right.
So, it's a circular thing. The other thing is that the industry in America, in Hollywood, is very much a corporate atmosphere of career producers. And they don't want to get fired. No one wants to get fired. I don't want to get fired. I know Johan Johansson didn't want to get fired. Well, the producers don't want to get fired either. And if their movie doesn't deliver, they're out. So they look at the landscape of hireable people and go, if I hire this person, will that get me fired or not? And if you hire Hans Zimmer, you're never going to get fired. If you hire Michael Giacchino, you're never going to get fired. He won an Oscar.
Yeah.
And that's not a dig on Michael. I mean, it's the truth. If I'm an executive at Disney, I'm never going to get fired for hiring Michael. But I might get fired if I hire Joe Kraemer and something goes wrong. Even if it's got nothing to do with the fact that I hired Joe Kraemer.
Yeah, I get your point. It sounds totally.
Which is probably why Ron Howard hasn't called me yet to do a movie. Because I haven't reached that point where I'm bulletproof.
Yeah, he should call you.
Well, whatever. I'm just using it as an example.
Yeah, sure.
It's the reality of the business. It's what we have to face when we get into this business. The two realities are you're going up against people who are bulletproof for jobs that you're not bulletproof, and you're dealing with the other thing we haven't talked about at all is that the industry is centered mostly on now teams that deliver a music product and not a composer who delivers a score that is sort of a singular vision. And in both of those cases, I'm a maverick on the outside. I write all my scores myself. I don't have any ghostwriters. And I'm not bulletproof because I don't have an Oscar. So, when you're up against a company that has to keep 30 composers constantly working, they're going to need a lot of movies to do that, which means the movies that are left over and available to people who are riskier hires are fewer and farther between.
Yeah.
Which, again, is why it's so amazing that I was able to do what I was able to do, not only on Mission Impossible, but also on Comrade Detective, which is write an orchestral score for a TV show. I mean, they're firing Alf off The Simpsons.
Yeah, I read about that as well. I mean, it's what can I say? It's terrible.
What can anyone say?
It's
But it's indicative of the disparity between what the audience reacts to and the decision making behind the studios.
Yeah, that's very well said. I mean, it's a tricky business. It's a Shark Tank. Yeah, I mean,
this whole thing is going off the rails. I totally apologize. I didn't mean to get off on this tangent. But
no. It's totally cool. I mean, it's great conversation here. Okay. Let's jump right into Comrade Detective.
Great.
You recorded a tremendous amount of music for this project. I mean, it was, if I'm not entirely wrong, it was almost 3 hours worth of music, and it's 6 episodes of the first season, right?
Yep.
How much music was actually used in the series? I mean, 3 hours of music, 6 episodes. How is the
Yeah, well, I mean, that breaks down to about a half hour music per episode, which sounds about right.
Yeah.
Because it was made for Amazon, it was made for streaming. Episode length was not a constraint like it might have been for a network. I do know it was an interesting process because I was hired before they did the plan had always been to shoot it in Romanian and then dub it into English. And use Romanian actors and then have Channing and Joe Gordon-Levitt dub it into English, as well as, other actors. And the schedule was such that I was brought on at a point before they had done the English language dub. So I scored it. I've only really seen the show in Romanian with subtitles. I've actually not had a chance to watch the show in English. So I know that once they dubbed the film, they made some tweaks to the editing because certain things that you could say in a few words in Romanian might take more words in English and vice versa. But there was we had a music editor, Sebastian Zuleta, who was really good and really able to adjust the music, which had already been recorded, to fit any changes that were made to the picture. And then the other thing is once the director heard everything live, there were certain bits that he fell in love with that he decided to use again at the expense of maybe bits that he wasn't as thrilled with, which, again, is part of the process, and I'm not in any way complaining about that. But, yeah, it was a lot of music because in addition to all the score I wrote, there were also source cues in most of the episodes, either 80s pop songs to help set the time period or Romanian music to help set the location. And I think each episode was, when I was scoring them, they varied from like high 30s to high 40s in terms of their length of the show. So for a 40-minute episode to have 29 minutes of score was not, you know, out of the question.
When did you get involved with the show, and how long did it actually take you to write this, huge amount of music?
Yeah, I first met with them around the end of February, I think, of 2017. And, it took a week or so to get hired on the project. And then after that, it took a week or so for episodes to start turning over. So I started writing in the middle of March, and then we recorded the score in April. So because I had to have the music done early enough for it to be prepared for the recording session, I had about 3 weeks to write the score. So I was writing each episode in about 3 days, half a week. So it happened fast. But I had that time between the first meeting and actually starting to write the cues to start developing thematic material. And as soon as I saw the piece, my subconscious was working on the score. So beginning to end, I spent about 6 weeks on it. But, let's see, mid-February to maybe early May. That'd be 4, 8, maybe 11 weeks total.
Okay.
But it was about 3 weeks of actual proper composing.
Okay.
Then there was mixing and editing.
Okay. Must have been a long working day, huh?
Yeah, it was. It wasn't. I'm not complaining, but it wasn't a joyride. It was stressful and intense and a lot of work. But it was worth it.
Okay. Did you ever kind of, break the 12-hour or 15-hour barrier a day?
Every day, yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely at least 12 hours a day. And then the recording sessions, I flew to Vienna. That's a 12-hour flight from Los Angeles to Vienna.
Yeah,
sure. Then I had a day to set up at the studio, so I had jet lag. Then I recorded for 2 days. Each of those was a 12-hour day, and then I flew back to LA. That was another 12-hour day. So the whole thing was fast and furious and long days. But again, it was an opportunity. The opportunity I was given was not one to turn down, and it was worth it because it was, I could have done the whole thing using samples, but it would have killed the joke of the piece. And I really wanted to use this orchestra in Vienna and this facility in Vienna, and I wanted to go there and conduct it. So I only have myself to blame for a lot of the long hours, but it was worth it.
Okay. Was Sandra Tomek involved in the scoring project? Because of
her company, Music Angels, did the music prep. So they were sent all of the sheet music, and they printed it out and arranged for it to be put on the stands.
Okay. Yeah, I figure. I'm actually going back to Vienna in 2 days to see
Hollywood in Vienna.
Yes, to see Danny Elfman, and I'm pretty sure I'm gonna run into Sandra as well.
Well, tell her I said hi.
Yeah, I will. I hope I will get the chance to talk to her. It can get rather stressful before
of course,
the show.
Yeah.
But I will definitely tell her you said hi.
Thanks.
Sure. Your music for Comrades, it does have really, a large deal of themes and also, the leitmotifs. And did you feel it was especially difficult to actually figure out what each scene and character should sound like?
No, not difficult. Not any more difficult than the job usually is. You know what I mean? In the sense that it was about... maybe a better way to put it is to explain it like this. What was unique about it was that I put myself in the headspace of... I imagined I was a composer living in Romania in 1983, 84, and I was given this assignment to score this TV show. And I was told to sort of emulate American cop shows and American cop movies, but undermine that with this pro-communist agenda. And so in my brain, I became this writer who was sort of doing this score and throwing in these little barbs at American culture and sort of glorifying the homeland of Romania through the score. And I suppose in the same way that McCartney said that pretending they were Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band freed them from the burden of being the Beatles, playing this character as a composer opened up my creativity in a way that it might not have if I thought, well, this is, I'm writing Joe Kraemer's follow-up to Mission Impossible. You know what I mean? Not that that's the same thing as Sgt. Pepper. I'm not delusional. But, in terms of my own self-expression, I didn't worry about whether or not I was reflecting my own taste anymore. I was thinking about this imaginary Romanian composer that scored the show. And that's why I thought it was so important to use live players, because I just thought that samples would give away much too obviously that this wasn't actually a vintage show that had been, discovered in a box and dubbed into English.
Yeah, could have gone either way.
Right.
Yeah, but I think it's great that TV shows or TV series kind of using more of an orchestral vibe, and
well, I don't think they are. I think it's just the opposite. I think they're not, which is why I feel very lucky. Now,
yeah, I meant in terms of your score now.
Yeah. Because like we just talked about, they're canning Alf off of Simpsons. Stranger Things, as great as it was, it was synth. It wasn't orchestral. Whereas if it had really been like an Amblin thing in the '80s, it probably would have been an orchestra, like Amazing Stories. Things like that. Lost was a live orchestra every week, or, live players every week. And I know there are still shows that are doing it, but I would say the majority of the work now is being done with samples.
Well, Lost, that was Michael G. Keener, right?
Yeah, it was Michael at the start, yeah.
Yeah, at the start, right.
By the end, God, he was doing so much work,
Okay, in terms of, the Comrade Detective, which aspect of the series did you find the most attractive, and what kind of, inspired you to come up with the music?
I love the locations, I have been very lucky since Mission to have spent a lot of time in Europe, different cities in Europe, and I really love it in England and Europe. The architecture and the pace of cities and city life and country life in Vienna, in Baden, in Hamburg, in London. And I loved what that feeling that I got of that when I watched Comrade Detective, which they filmed in Romania. And the score, in terms of the instruments that I picked, hopefully I reflected that. It was my hope that it would sound like a Romanian trying to do Hollywood rather than Hollywood trying to do Romanian. The look of it was great. The costumes, that brown leather coat that the main guy wears is great, and then the sort of rural country bumpkin that that Joseph has, his character has, is great too. A lot of the sort of more kitschy 80s stuff was actually done more with the source music and the costume design. I thought a lot about Airplane, and how if you listen to Elmer Bernstein's score to Airplane away from the film, it sounds like a proper score for a disaster movie. And I kind of wanted that with this. I didn't want the music to be funny. I wanted the juxtaposition of the music to the visual to be funny. But in order to make that work, the music kind of had to play it straight. So that was part of that was an aesthetic that was in the film that I reacted to as well, where the film chose to play things straight and what aspects of the film, it's shot very conventionally. It's not shot goofy. And when goofy things happen, they sort of happen within the context of the show that is being shot fairly classically. And I wanted to reflect that in the music.
Oh, great. How detailed or specific was the communication with the producing team and director? Did they give you very, let's say, specific instructions, or did they just, give you lots of leeway here?
I feel like I was given an appropriate amount of leeway and a good constructive amount of guidance. I didn't feel sort of strangled by micromanaging, and I didn't feel like I was sort of left to flounder on my own and figure out what the heck to do. Rhys Thomas, the director, pointed out some other work I'd done in the past that he really liked, and those sort of served as a starting point for me to begin putting ideas together to show him as sort of concepts. And in much the same way, like a director will do thumbnails, which become the storyboards, which become the shot list, I would do little tiny sketches of, maybe piano and maybe or strings, simple things that I would kind of just bang out and then send them to him to get his thoughts. And then from there, I was able to hone down the sketch material to my cheat sheet and begin scoring the show. There were detailed notes on a cue-by-cue basis, and then it was up to me to execute the notes that I agreed with and to see if there was a compromise possible on the notes that I didn't agree with, or that I thought might be addressed in a different way. And some of them were an issue of mock-up versus live, because I knew it was going to be live. I didn't spend a lot of time making the mock-up as realistic as I would have if I knew it had to be out of the box. And, to reassure him that, no, that when that's live, it'll flow and it'll build, because there's so many things you get for free with live players that take a day to get even close with mock-ups. And then I was very clear from the beginning that the director had my blessing, if you will, to do whatever he wanted to do with the music after it was recorded and submitted to him. And so if he wanted to take all the music from episode 1 and use that for the whole series and throw everything else out, that was his prerogative, and I was totally okay with that. Because, again, the schedule was such that there wasn't necessarily the amount of time to micromanage every single cue.
Okay. Will there be an album of the whole show?
We're working on it. I hope there will be. I don't have anything specific to announce yet, but I know there's interest, and I know that there are conversations taking place.
Okay. But I figure I also haven't decided yet whether it will be digital only or also physical CD.
Well, I know that one group of people I'm speaking to would like to do both.
Sounds reasonable.
Yep.
I must admit, I'm really not a download guy. I
totally think what's great about digital downloads, iTunes, Amazon, the ones that are legal and go by the book, is that the risk is minimized for the people putting the music out. And so if you're a fan of my score to Comrade Detective and you want to get it, and the only way to get it is digital download, the reason for that is probably that after some research and study, it was decided that no one would break even if we did a CD.
Yeah.
And I don't think any of us want to. I would rather have the music out there as a download than not at all.
That's totally true. Maybe I should have been more specific. Maybe it's because I'm a collector and
right. No, I get you. Like, if it's available on CD, I'd rather have the CD. But if it's not available at all, I'd rather have it legally out there.
That's very true. If the only possibility to get a hold of the music is the download via Amazon, then I will happily
Yeah.
do it, of course.
Yeah.
But I'm still one of those guys that actually prefer a physical CD as opposed to yeah.
And I think you're right. I think I agree with you as well that most film music collectors are in the same boat. The question is finding that sweet spot where the product is guaranteed to sell enough CDs that the company putting it out doesn't lose money.
Yeah.
Because if they do too many of those, then nothing comes out, you know?
Very true. I mean, yeah, I mean, there's always, there's two sides to a coin, and you also have to take into account the fans' perspective or the collector's perspective, and of course, business-wise, does it make sense to actually release a full album or actually to do a two CD set? So you always have to take
Yep.
different things into consideration, and I mean it happens nowadays on many occasions. Even let's say albums by certain composers, popular composers, an album doesn't get released physically; it's only digitally. So there is a certain trend, and well, it's for better or worse.
Yeah, it's true. Well, and I think that's why we're seeing this predominance now of these deluxe box sets. That they're
Yeah.
trying to turn buying something into like like an investment rather than just like, and you'll see like, well, regular albums, people just get them on Spotify. I mean, it's sort of like Blu-ray. I mean, physical media in America is perishing relatively quickly in favor of streaming, and people just don't want to dedicate a whole room of shelf space to their movie collection anymore when it can sit on Apple TV and not take up any space at all.
It takes up space, yeah. That's very true.
I mean, I'm guilty of this when it comes to my comic book collection because I've been donating all of my graphic novels to libraries because I can read them on my iPad Pro, and I don't have the room in my house anymore to store everything.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's
So
I can totally relate to that. I mean, like I said, I collect movies, I collect music, so well,
yeah,
it
yeah. I mean, I'm sure my movie collection would probably drive you crazy because I've taken all the films out of the boxes and just put them in little white envelopes. And then I put those envelopes in these sort of shoebox type things. You know,
sacrilegious.
I know, but it's like I've got like 2,000 movies. I don't have room for it all anymore.
Yeah.
So
Have they announced plans for a second season yet?
I have heard nothing, but that doesn't mean it's not being talked about. They haven't. If they are talking about it, they haven't mentioned it to me yet. I would love to do a second season. I'll throw that out there. And I know I'm Twitter friends with a lot of people who acted in the show, and we're all very proud of it, very excited by the possibility of doing more. So, if the audience is there, I think the product will, the project will continue. That's my
Okay.
hope.
Yeah, let's hope so. Um, okay, one final question, maybe, if I may,
Sure.
if I may.
Of course.
Do you have any future projects lined up that you actually can talk about at this moment?
Yes, yes. I'm very excited to talk about another TV show, which I'm just finishing up the last few episodes right now. It's going to premiere around Halloween in England. It's a co-production between the CBBC and Family Channel in Canada. It's called Creeped Out, and it's an anthology show. It's sort of like Twilight Zone or Goosebumps or,
Cool.
Black Mirror for kids. So every week, it's a different story about kids getting into mischief, but it's very creepy, and they've all got sort of a twist storyline. And it's been great fun working on it, and it'll be out, like I said, it'll premiere around Halloween.
Okay. Great.
Yeah. Oh, and then the other thing I can say is that I'm working on a CD of music that I originally wrote as a score for a silent film made in 1927 called Sunrise by F.W. Murnau. And I've adapted that music into a standalone piece, which I recorded over the summer, and I'll be editing and mixing and mastering that through the fall, and hopefully that'll be announced for CD before too long.
Okay.
So
Great. So you got lots
yeah.
going on at the moment, and I of course wish you the best of luck with all your projects.
No, thank you very much. It's great to talk to you.
Yeah, it was totally great. I mean, we've gone for 80 minutes in total.
Oh
That's
no,
yes, 80 minutes.
you can't shut me up. That's the problem.
No, it's totally. I mean, I would actually love to go on for another hour, but I'm afraid I'm gonna take too much time out of your work schedule here.
All right. Well,
Um,
maybe after you see some Creeped Out, we can talk about that.
yeah, sure, sure. I mean, totally. We can totally synchronize more dates in the future. I would be totally happy to. It was lots of fun.
Thanks
And
for having me, man.
yeah, sure. Thank you for taking so much time out of your schedule, and I'm pretty sure we will talk again and also meet up in the future.
Very good.
And okay, thank you so much for your time, and have a nice day. See you later.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.